We are in the middle of a revolution. AI can now do things we didn't dream possible just a few years or even months ago. As China's DeepSeek shows, innovation is getting cheaper and more accessible. Meanwhile, Alphabet, one of the world's most powerful tech companies, says it's now willing to develop AI weapons. So what next? Onto that, let's talk to Azeem Azhar. He's a futurist and founder of the Exponential View, a newsletter and podcast focused on the future of tech. Hi, Azeem. Thank you so much for being with us. You first wrote about DeepSeek back in 2023, ahead of the curve, but you are a futurist. How much of a game changer is it?
Well, DeepSeek proves, as you pointed out, that innovation can take place anywhere. DeepSeek is bred out of constraints. The Chinese AI scene is constrained because it doesn't have access to the same amount of risk capital that exists in Silicon Valley. And it's constrained because in the last 2 or 3 years, Americans have put more and more stringent controls on the high-end chips that you need in order to develop AI. And of course, from these constraints has come a great deal of creativity. And DeepSeek has benefited from working hard under that pressure. How much of a game changer is it? Well, I think it's a game changer because it's got everybody to respond. I mean, right across the world, it became the #1 story. It's probably greater than the reality of the technical innovations, but that's irrelevant. It's changed the nature of the game despite all of that.
So if DeepSeek shows that you can do more with less, are we just going to see an even bigger acceleration in AI development with AI systems training each other exponentially?
Well, what we should understand is that what DeepSeek proved was that you could train a final model, like the final end stage of a long process of research and development and investment, for somewhat less, perhaps substantially less than the American systems. But in order to be at the cutting edge, it's quite likely that you are going to need these very substantial investments in chips and data centers and research time and researchers that will run into the hundreds of millions and billions of dollars. But DeepSeek has shown that if you want to be a fast follower or a leading laggard, you can do it far more cheaply than people had expected. And I think you're absolutely right. The net result will be an acceleration, both of efforts to push the frontier forward and of those who are copying and following to follow faster. And of course, for companies who ultimately are the ones who put these technologies in our hands to work even harder to do exactly that.
How significant is it that DeepSeek is open source?
It's extremely significant that we have seen an open source model. What this means is that anyone can download the model, can run it on their local computer or on their office servers. I, in fact, have DeepSeek running on my desktop computer. It distributes and proliferates the technology. That's compared to closed source, which people may be familiar with in OpenAI's ChatGPT, where we can't run the models ourselves. We have to access them through a web application. Open source will breed collaboration, it will breed creative applications, and it'll breed much more widespread use of the technology.
What was the incentive for DeepSeek to offer this as an open source model?
You know, I think that's a really great question, and it's one that I've been puzzling around myself. You know, there are things that people say in their announcements. Well, we want to further science, we want to share knowledge. You know, I think that there is a very, very strong heritage in the internet for the core technologies to be open sourced. And while many of us will use corporate products like Instagram or eBay, a lot of the software upon which those products are built are in fact open sourced. As ordinary consumers, we don't see that. So I suspect that there's a combination of just being part of the internet infrastructure. There's a combination of making a bigger and bigger splash. There's a recognition that a model that is hosted in China on Chinese servers may not spread as far as a model that people can run locally. And all of those things will contribute to the decision to make this open source.
There's also the perception of transparency, of course. Do you think this is relevant in this example?
I think it helps a great deal that this Chinese model is open source. When you run and access DeepSeek through their servers, which are based in China, the output is censored by the application itself. So if you ask questions that are seen as being politically sensitive in mainland China or to the Chinese Communist Party, you won't get answers from DeepSeek. In fact, what it will say, it'll think for a long time, it'll say, I don't really want to answer that, but I could help you with maths or coding. Once you get the model on your local computer, as I have done, you can ask all of those questions, all of those politically sensitive questions, and it will give you the results. So the AI model itself has been trained in such a way that allows it to answer those, but there's a censorship layer that sits in the Chinese application that prevents you seeing it. So I think for this model to have any kind of traction, for DeepSeek to make any kind of splash in the market, they would have needed to make it open source.
Interesting stuff. Now, these changes are happening faster than most people can really comprehend, myself included. What kind of guardrails do we need? And is there any prospect at all of reaching some kind of global consensus on regulation?
I think it's very difficult to imagine at the moment there being a global consensus, because global consensus requires collaboration and it requires a spirit of working together. And the reason we won't see that, of course, is that there's a new regime emerging from the White House, which is actually about disengagement from collaborative groups and multilateral organizations and arrangements. So I think it's unlikely, with that sense of spirit pervading the White House, that there will be a state level set of agreements. And what really matters here, of course, is the US and China. And that's going to be against the backdrop of increasing geostrategic competition between the countries. So in the sense that we might need guardrails, it's going to be hard to get them multilaterally. The one thing I would say, though, is that if we look at the risks that emerge from AI, right now it is advantage defender. So it's the defenders who are using AI to protect us from cyber attacks who have the upper hand on the attackers who might be using AI increasingly to mount those attacks. And I do wonder whether that advantage can persist. I'm reasonably optimistic that it can.
Now, the EU has imposed guardrails with the AI Act. What is your response to that? Is that a good piece of legislation?
My mood has shifted on the AI Act. I really do believe that technologies serve humanity broadly and markets as well better when there are understood rules of the game within which they should play. I think the consideration that the EU has to take, and I think they've probably made a mistake here, is that this is an incredibly important technology. We don't really know how it's going to play out. But what we do know is that technologies increasingly are winner-take-all markets. You get so much strategic advantage from being first and being early. And it's so uncertain to be the person building those technologies that any speed bump in the road is unwanted and unwelcome, and is likely to make you not even come second or third, but maybe not finish the race at all. And so I think one of the biggest problems the EU has is that mindset that we need to be very fast with regulation. Regulation is required, but you face a hard choice right now, which is, do you want the productivity benefits? Do you want the growth in your economies? Do you want increased sustainability from better science powered by AI? Or do you want to start to regulate it very quickly? And I think the calculus has changed in the last 2 or 3 years around where you should sit.
So is there any way that the European Union could catch up in this context?
Well, we've got lots of advantages in Europe widely. And you said the European Union. I'm in the UK right now, but include me for a moment. We have many advantages. We have fantastic technical talent, superb engineers. We also have lots of data in other places. And we have industries that haven't yet been susceptible to lots of AI. In industry, for example, it's a hard manufacturing. I think the challenge here is that in order to marshal all of that, what you really need is you need risk capital, and you need frameworks that allow founding scientists to become entrepreneurs and to really, really get on it. That is the story of Silicon Valley from Fairchild Semiconductor and Intel 40 and 60 and 70 years ago. That was a story of the early internet, and it's also the story of OpenAI and Anthropic and all those other firms. It's not about the breadth, the width, the talent. It's not about the number of flags you can put around a big building. It is actually about, can you support these scientist entrepreneurs with the right risk capital and get the hurdles out the way to allow them to build products that serve the market?
So if I understand you right, this is essentially a problem of risk aversion in Europe as a whole.
It's a problem of risk aversion. It's a problem of not having a lean forward attitude towards technology. It's a problem about the biggest success being perceived to be a piece of regulation rather than a piece of innovation.
Now, I want to talk about another risk factor, and that is the role of AI in warfare. We had the news that Alphabet now says it is willing to develop AI weapons, something that it previously rejected as an idea. How much of a sea change is this move, and what does it mean for the future of warfare?
Well, as you rightly said, Alphabet had refused to work with the Pentagon. In fact, what had happened several years ago, they had signed what was then seen as a large contract to help the Pentagon with AI, and the workers had really rebelled against that, and so they had walked back. There has been a vibe shift in the world. There's been a vibe shift in Europe, because there is an enormous and bloody land war that is persisting year after year. It's affecting Europeans daily. There has also been a shift in the dynamics between China and the US, even during the Biden administration. And of course, we now have a very different stance coming out of Washington, DC. I think under that context and that change in the environment, it's not surprising to me that the AI firms are starting to say, we are building a strategically valuable capability, and we need to put it to use in national security. So I'm not surprised. I can imagine people in Alphabet, some of them are rather unhappy, but the world is different today to how it was 6 years ago.
When you mention this vibe change and the many conflicts we are seeing right now, do you mean that the prospect of using AI-powered weapons is close? I mean, are we talking about the next few years that we're going to see these kinds of weapons employed on the battlefield?
They're already being employed on the battlefield in Ukraine, as the Ukrainians defend themselves from this unwanted invasion from Russia. And no doubt the Russians are using similar techniques. We also know that these tools are used in other modern militaries across the Middle East as well. And what I would say is that the spectrum of warfare has changed. When we think about warfare as ordinary citizens, we may think about tanks and bombs and explosions. But of course, a lot of warfare happens within the radio frequency spectrum in what's known as electronic warfare, to jam drones and guided weapons and GPS. It also happens in the cyber domain. And of course, it happens in the information domain with disinformation, misinformation, and those types of campaigns. So when you look at that full spectrum of what conflict now looks like and how military experts think about the shades of grey, many of them have already been occupied by the techniques and tools of AI. And what we're now seeing is an increasing willingness to expand beyond that. But we're past that point where we've seen whether AI tools can make a difference on the battlefield, and they are doing that in Ukraine today.
As a futurist, do you think this makes the world a safer or a less safe place?
There are so many factors that contribute to a sense of safety and a sense of security and mutual trust that are beyond the technology. And there comes a moment where high walls make good neighbors. And walking that line between having strong defenses and being willing to defend and being able to punch if you need to, and falling into an arms race that inevitably ends up in conflict, which has been part of Europe's story in the last century, is a very, very narrow line to walk. But it's not simply about technology. But I think that adage is true, that you can get peace through strength. And that was NATO's motto, I believe, for many years, may still even be the motto today. So I do think that we have to be very careful with this. We have to recognize that it's coming, but through that, we may actually be able to defend ourselves and maintain peace for much longer and in many more different parts of the world.
We hear so much about this idea of an AI arms race, but at what point will it become apparent who has emerged victorious?
It's a great question. We're using the AI arms race, of course, here in a slightly different context to the military context. I think we're broadly saying who's going to have the best AI systems. And I think it's a really hard measure, because we don't really define AI particularly well. It's this fuzzy idea that it's computers doing things that humans could otherwise do. But in many cases in AI, they do things that we simply could never do and ever do. And so I think it's a bit tricky to draw a clear set of benchmarks that tell us. What I would say is that AI is another technology. So nations that have a good attitude towards using technology will be advantaged in all of that. And so to that extent, that always has me leaning towards the US, that the US will lead in the development and the deployment of this technology, but that it is the nature of technologies to embed surprises in them. So I could imagine paths, although unlikely, where China might be able to overtake.
Azeem Azhar, thank you so much for speaking to us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.